Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we're going to talk about the very dreadful topic of finances. And so we have a very special guest here, Dr. Ali DeGraff, to talk to us about financial therapy. Like, what is that? How is it different than maybe financial advising? But something that is very scary for a lot of us. So
especially
welcome.
I'm already sweating.
So welcome, Dr. DeGraff. Tell us a little bit about, your background and what financial therapy is, how you even got into this field.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for inviting me here. My name's Ali DeGraff. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. So I have a practice here in Austin, Texas, where I'm based.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm also licensed in Florida and Pennsylvania, so I do some stuff there.
That's cool.
Yeah. What is financial therapy? So basically, financial therapy is therapy, the same kind of therapy that we all do as licensed therapists, but we focus on money and our relationship with money. And so in the same way that we may talk about your relationship with your partner, we kind of work on the emotional, behavioral, spiritual, physical aspects of money patterns, money themes, the intergenerational patterns of money. So it's really kind of a broad topic. But yeah, so.
And how'd you get into that? Like, how did you like, oh, I'm going to be a marriage family therapist, but I really want to like focus on money.
Yes, I would love to know. It's fascinating.
Kim has a lot of anxiety during this topic.
Taking personal notes over here.
Yeah, so I started basically in my master's program. I went to school at Texas Tech University in their marriage and family therapy program. And I made some friends in the personal financial planning department, just at like college events or whatever. They were kind of down the hall from where my department was located. And there were a couple faculty, Dottie Durbin, one I'm particularly thinking of, who was studying kind of like these emotional aspects of money, right? Like we think about, if you make a budget, you should be able to follow it and kind of be financially successful. But their research was kind of asking the question of like, why don't people follow the budget or the spending plan? Well, obviously because people are not totally rational and we have emotions that make us. Yeah, I know, it's kind of crazy, right? And I was really, really interested in that. So I took I wanted to be able to talk about money, but because of my own personal history, it was like kind of like Kim, like something I was really anxious about it. Ever want to talk about it with anyone. It was something that I was very like private about. So anyway, I started taking some financial planning courses as like, if you could have a minor in your master's program, I kind of did it like that. I just took some classes in that department. And then I started like becoming really interested in why we don't talk about this in therapy. Like we study religion and sex and all these kind of really intimate aspects of people's lives, but not one program that I looked into besides Kansas State, Georgia, and Texas Tech taught about money. And those programs don't even like make you kind of take a class on finances or money as a therapist. They just collaborated with kind of the interdepartmental collaboration. So anyway, but before that, I grew up like not rich. And so my dad was in the military and we were like an enlisted family. And I was, for whatever reason, acutely aware of kind of like the class system in the military. I had known of like officers and their families, and like we weren't allowed to be friends with the officers' kids, and so I was like, social class finances was something I was aware of as a little kid. And I think the last thing I want to say about that is, in the US, we have a lot of respect for military families. But when I was a little kid and my dad was in the military, we were on food stamps for a long time. And like, I could never understand, like, wait, we're this like cool military family. My people tell my dad, thanks for your service. But like, on the other hand, we're like kind of relying on these social welfare programs. How does that, like,
no one talks about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of like probably the early seeds of that were planted that really kind of made me become interested in people's financial lives, and not necessarily how much money do you have in the bank and how are you saving money or how are you spending money, but like, what's your relationship like with money? Yeah, I know that was a little bit disjointed of a story, but that's how I got into it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like that seed was there. And then when you went to Texas Tech and that came up, it kind of blossomed of like, oh my God, yes. And it leads to my curiosity. You asked that question the second time you've asked that of like, what's your relationship with money? What does that typically look like for people? Like what are some things that you get in session with that?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. To be completely honest, when I start talking about money with my clients, they're like, okay, like, I think I can drop down to every other week, or I think I'm done with all the work that I...
That's me.
Avoidance.
No, and this is like after we've talked about like, you know, deepest, darkest corners of their sex lives and like the things that are, you know, way back in their kind of shame buckets. So to be honest, a lot of clients don't let me go there. But it does happen. So I work from a like experiential and kind of IFS model. For people that are listening, that's internal family systems, Dick Schwartz. And essentially the theory or the model kind of rejects the idea of black and white, kind of all or nothing dichotomous thinking, and we think about things in this kind of multiplicity perspective. And so what that sounds like in a therapy session is that we all have parts of ourselves. You know, this part shows up to do a podcast, and this part shows up to like drink a beer with my friends, and this part shows up when I'm teaching my students. And so we have these parts that are sometimes opposed, sometimes they're aligned, kind of like an internal family. And so I start talking about money and finances with my clients as a part of them, right? Like, what is this part of you that, you know, for some clients, it's very clear financial things. Like, I'm thinking of a client that I'm working with right now who he's a business executive, and one of his financial CFO type person like stole a bunch of money from him. And so that, you know, he brings that to therapy as like, my friend betrayed me. But I may start to explore that as, you know, kind of like approaching it as a trauma, right? And we have this financial trauma, and this part of him that doesn't trust anyone with his money anymore. So I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of forgot.
No, yeah. No, that makes sense. When you think about, because that relationship with money, right? And their relationship is, it's a traumatic experience because of somebody betrayed them. And I think of a client from my own, like they grew up where the only time their family talked about money was when it was stress. So now it's stress for them. And there's a kind of the narrative they develop from that stress of, if I don't have money, I'm going to be homeless or I'm going to be in the streets. And like, this is like a very irrational fear for this person because of that dynamic and narrative that came up. And
creates like a core fear. That's where mine comes from, right? Is like, I can picture my mom. She did QuickBooks for my dad's business. Every Sunday, we avoided mom at 4 p.m. because she was going to do books. And it was crying. It was yelling. It was frustration. And that was my only interaction with money growing up, right? And that didn't change until a few years ago. And so it creates this like deep core wound and insecurity of even now, like we're pretty financially secure. It's still a fear of like, but it could change anytime. Or am I missing something? And it isn't as simple as just money in and of itself. It really is this deep wound and fear.
Which is that relationship.
Like the symbolic. Exactly. Right. Like we have this symbolic much of it is like cultural, I think, and like the US, but we have this symbolic meaning of money where it's like money means something about our worth, who we are as a person. And so I like to explore that relation. That's what I guess what I mean by like relationship, like these symbolic concepts or these value assignments that we assign to ourselves based on how well we're doing financially or how we're not doing financially. So
I imagine part of that is power, right? One thing my husband and I talk about, he's ironically, he is a banker.
Unconsciously, she married her worst fear.
My fear. Still holds true. Just kidding, honey. But where is the power of that relationship? Is the power in the money itself, or am I in control or power of my money?
Right. I think that's a really good question. And I like my therapist answer is kind of both, because in our society, money is power.
It's true.
And without money, you don't have a lot of power. So, but also, yes, like, do you have power over your money? Absolutely. I assume that, your basic needs of living are met. So to some extent, you do have that privilege, right?
And it's interesting, Allie, that you're talking, because you're talking about how you work with people's parts, right? And maybe the financial insecurity is a part of them, or there's a part of them that's financially insecure, but that's shaped by this larger cultural picture we're talking about. And what meaning does money have in your culture, and where do you stand in relation to that meaning? And then work with that part. Like, what is that part? Like, I can imagine how many people that part of them shrivels up and is like in a dark corner when you ask them about it in therapy. Again, like you said before, despite all these other dark things you've gone through, the money thing comes up. And I think it's interesting too, because what you talked about is a lot of us therapists, we don't talk about this. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
So there's a study by, I'm forgetting their name. I've been trying to think about it all morning. I should have Googled it.
You can send us the resource later and we'll share it with the listeners.
Well, so they're a group of, I think, financial planners, CFPs, and they did a study that essentially found that mental health professionals, or people kind of in the helping profession, which just by knowing this group, it's therapists that they surveyed. They found that therapists were particularly money avoidant, more so than other professions that they compared them to. And like kind of in that schema, if you will, of money avoidance, you'll find narratives that are like, money makes people evil. I don't deserve to have a lot of money. So there are these things that we tell ourselves as therapists that make us behave in ways that, like, we just don't want to think about it. We don't want to talk about it. And so for the therapists that are listening, I'll ask, like, have you ever struggled to confront or set a boundary with a client that is like, months behind on paying their session fees? Does that bring you anxiety and stress to think about? Or a lot of therapists that struggle setting their rates, and they think like, oh, that's too high. Like, I'm not worth that, air quotes. I was having a conversation with one of my friends who's a therapist, and I was telling him about, I have another friend who works in academia, and I'm a huge advocate for financial transparency and like salary transparency. And I was telling him that I have a lot of guilt around comparing my salary to my friends that work in academia and my friends that work in industry. Like, it's really kind of broad, the salary ranges. And so, like, I mean, even I feel that kind of guilt, and my initial reaction is to avoid it, right? I want to be helpful and kind and aware of your emotional reactions. And yeah, so we're just the kind of people that are typically money avoidant, which is really interesting, because we're trained to talk about all the other taboo things with our clients, or all the other secret things, the very vulnerable parts of them, but we're like super avoidant of this particular topic.
Yeah. And I think for those of you listening, I mean, I hope this gives some sense of normalization that even your therapist or ourselves in this position aren't even wanting to talk about money. It is. And what are your thoughts, Allie, about why it's such a tough topic for a lot of people? I guess what are some of the maybe more common narratives you hear of that? Because it definitely elicits a lot of stress for a lot of people, and maybe that's for different reasons. But are there some common reasons that you see it in your work?
Yeah, I think I don't know why. I just know that it is still a very powerful spirit that lives in our culture, and I think lots of cultures. I think some people think that, talking about money is tacky. When I had this conversation about my salary and kind of what I earn, and I was very transparent, the things that I told myself after that interview was like, ew, that feels kind of like gross, kind of like self-centered. I don't know. So I don't know why that is. I just know that that's a common reaction, and it's not unique to me. It's in my clients, it's in the therapists that I train. I used to be a hiring manager at a clinic here, and I would hire therapists. They would never negotiate their salary, even though we had
Flexibility.
Yeah, we had the flexibility to do. I don't know. I wish I knew why, because then I would have an answer to fixing it. But yeah, I just know it's a thing.
Yeah.
I just think about how laden even the word money is, right? If we say money, people have an emotional reaction to just that word alone, right? Not even talking about how much of it, right? But if we just say money or cash or resource, whatever,
finances,
people have an emotional reaction. So I imagine that's part of it. And it is fostered, right, from when we're little all the way through our adulthood. And this feeling of scarcity versus abundance and the ebb and flow of it.
Yep.
So don't put any of those terms in our title so people don't avoid listening to this podcast.
I mean, the word sex, because everyone will click on it if it says sex.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. Sex and money. We'll put that.
I talk a lot about like how those topics are very similar in therapy. Like I just had a session with a client earlier this week where I was like, okay, like we're going to start talking about these parts and how they show up in your sexual life. And she's like, I don't know. Like, so yeah, people have a similar reaction initially to sex and money. Like they're taboo topics. So.
And let's talk about how this stress, whatever that looks like for somebody, whatever that narrative is, or whatever their relationship to money is, let's talk about how that shows up even in relationships. Because I talk about with some of my clients, they will show no involvement in the financial planning. It's almost like, well, I grew up with my mom who didn't do any of the finances, and I'm in a heterosexual relationship. I'm the wife. So therefore, like, that's just what the husband does. Like, there's these kind of
Are you talking about my marriage right now?
No.
I feel personally offended. I attacked her.
But there's like this, they don't want to acknowledge it. And that's just kind of this normal, like, understanding of how money works in that. And that includes the stress that's not really necessarily navigated. So.
Yeah. So your question is like, how does this show up in relationships with people? Right.
Yeah. And how does that stress around money kind of impact the dynamics? Because it is a stress that we don't talk about, but yet it's a stress that impacts the relationships, which is so interesting.
And in like lots of statistics, you'll hear often like money is one of the top reasons people get divorced.
But it's not. It's the people and how they manage it. Thank you.
Right.
Oh, Lord.
That felt personal.
I hate, because you cited that, and I always think about that. It's like everyone's like, oh, money is the top reason. I'm like, it's not. It's how you manage it. It's how you navigate it.
Yeah, how you negotiate, how the relationship is gonna. Yeah. So when I do couples work around money, I do a lot of work, kind of like Kim, what you were talking about, these financial schemas that we learn from being little kids, what our parents instill in us, right? And so typically, if so, let's say you have two therapists in a relationship, right? And both are money avoidant. You're going to have, someone's going to have to step up and not avoid the money. Like someone has to pay the bills, right? And make sure that we're saving for retirement. And so I almost find when I have these conversations, like, tell me your first memory about money. My first memory about money is kind of traumatic. I was eating cereal at the kitchen table and I wanted some more. And my mom said, we don't have milk. And I said, well, go to the store and get some milk, Mom. And she's like, you think we have money for milk? And so there was that like kind of scarcity part for me that then grew up and informs the way that I kind of deal with or manage money and money conversations now. Now my partner is much more vigilant with money. And so his first, like, his first money story is not really traumatic. It's like his mom used to give him $20 and drop him off at the mall for the day, and he would go hang out with his friends. So it's like a much more pleasant experience, right? So I think I do a lot of exploring those kind of core beliefs, Kim, I think is how you described it. And what were they like as little kids, and how have those things, those narratives, those schemas grown up and inform how we're relating now? Typically in couples that are having problems, they have very similar financial schemas or money schemas. I've noticed that if I can kind of train them to negotiate roles that are more complementary, right? Like if a couple comes to me and they say the man is supposed to manage all the money and both are in agreement, I'm like, okay, if that works for you, cool. But let's talk about like, how do you empower the other partner to at least be willing to know about the finances, right? Because there's a huge power dynamic that comes when one person is completely shut out. That's true for any topic that we talk about with couples therapy. So yeah, it's kind of getting them to navigate or negotiate a dynamic that works for them. But yeah, did I answer your question?
Yeah. And that's key. And that's, sorry, say that again.
I feel like I'm rambling. I don't know.
No, very helpful information. And I think the key there is you allow it to be what they want. How do they navigate it? And does it work for them? And I think that's still important to navigate, like, okay, well, what you think works, is it causing stress in any way? And how do we tweak it? And like, what do we do here around this? And I love the idea that you're bringing back the core beliefs, because how do those mix together? How do those core beliefs now work as an adult and their understanding of how money is going to work in their relationship? Because now they're independent of their parents. Like there's no dependency or whoever they were dependent upon before, right?
How do you work with a couple, say I knew this couple and it hypothetically were me. How do you work with a couple where one person is extremely avoidant and the other partner is not, and the other partner wants the avoidant partner to be included? But say that avoidant partner doesn't want to be. How do you handle that?
I actually work with a few couples with a similar pattern. So I think in the same way for the therapists that are listening, right? Like how would I would kind of replace that money avoidance with like sex avoidance or any kind of other conflict avoidance, and start there. And so what I do is I spend a lot of time exploring that avoidance. If you guys are getting tired of my IFS language, I apologize. But like, what part of you, like, what's the part of you that's avoiding this conversation? What is that avoidance protecting? So for a lot of people, that avoidance is protecting some sort of kind of deeper wound or some shame or the idea of worthiness, worth as a human. Those are kind of the common ones that come with finances. And then I I work to kind of empower that person to, I don't necessarily need them to be an active money manager if the couple relationship is fine with that. Like, it's not my place to say you both need to be active in your money, but I do want them to kind of pull their head out of the sand and be aware, right? At least, like, for example, I have a couple right now where the male partner is the primary breadwinner, manages all the money. They have a lot of money too. And the female partner wants nothing to do with it. Like, she kind of wants to be the homemaker. And there's also like some significant mental health stuff going on in that relationship with the female partner. Well, with both partners, but the female partner becomes, because of her own upbringing and trauma, if and when she feels kind of a fear of abandonment that her husband's going to leave her, she starts to like hoard money, right? And she will like call their attorney and be like, I just want to make sure that he hasn't like taken me off of the trusts and all this other stuff. And so for her, the work to do is to explore like what is driving that kind of abandonment and then subsequent like hoarding reaction. And it almost kind of like reminds me of the dynamics of like the binge purge kind of disordered eating, where it's like I'm totally avoidant, head in the sand. I don't want to know anything. You manage everything. Something happens, I get triggered, and this like really core fear arises, and then I hoard all the money, right? So
interesting.
Yeah. So for her, the work is to really kind of explore that pattern that happens, and how do you decrease that polarization of those two opposite kinds of reactions, right? And find somewhere that's more comfortable and safe in the middle. And for her, it's about safety and protection. And they have kids, so she wants to make sure the kids are taken care of. But yeah, so I don't know if that's a helpful story to kind of highlight some couples work, but
yeah, it's an insightful in the sense that here you have money as more of a symptom, and you're like, well, why is money? What is the money? Like, why money? Is that the one you go to hoard in this context? And that goes back to their understanding of the role of money, right? I mean, it plays such a big part, even in the dynamic that you just talked about. That, I mean, it's just
think about anxiety, depression, trauma.
Oh my, yeah.
Or like all these things we talk about, money kind of can play a role into them, or at minimum, become a symptom of one of those things.
And I feel like,
I like the way.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I like the way that you describe it as a symptom, because it's true. Like the way that when I talk a lot about finances with therapists and clients, and I've never thought to describe it as a symptom of a larger problem, but it's true, right? Like it's the same thing with eating disorder, substance use, like
sex. If sex isn't happening in a relationship, it's a symptom of a greater discord.
Exactly. And I'm like, you guys we're all trained really well already on how to talk about money. It's because it's not like it's not the big scary thing. It's a symptom of a larger dynamic. I love that language.
It isn't an access to disorder, right? Money management. What I find fascinating too, and I don't know your thoughts on this, is unless it's deliberately talked about and taught as a child, most people just go through life of just money is money and it's there. And there's really
we don't teach it.
There's no intentional understanding of how to approach it and work with it. And so we take a lot of our parents' stuff, right? I see my own habits in my parents. I won't say what that is in case they're listening, but it's interesting because they reflect back, and I suggest a lot of people look back and be like, how did your parents spend money? How do you do that similar to them? And is it helpful?
Or pendulum swing.
Or the opposite.
Right. My parents were such, like, I hear people talk about how my parents were stingy or whatever, didn't want to spend a dime. So I'm going to be really frivolous with my spending and spend it on all the things. Or, well, my parents had a lot of debt and it's no big deal, so I'm going to acquire a lot of debt, whatever it might be. We see that.
We're like credit cards are norm, right? like, oh, credit cards are normal. Like we can get whatever credit card, put $40,000. We can put a car on a credit card. But I like what you said, because I do see that too, where some of the clients where they grew up very poor now are in a higher SES and they just spend everything. Cause I never had it growing up. I want everything now. And it almost kind of puts them in the same situation because now they have no money.
And a fear that that's going to,
Yep.
if the money is going to go away, I might as well spend it while I have it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So now you guys are getting into that kind of intergenerational dynamics of finances. In the same way, right? Like I was raised really religious and now I'm not religious at all. You have that kind of initial total rejection, or you have, for example, with the religion, like I was raised really religious. Now I'm not religious at all, but I'm still incredibly rigid. Like I think, which is what you're describing, Kim, of like, we totally reject and try to do the opposite of what our parents taught us and how they were, but we still are like recreating the rigidity, right? Or am I making anyone nervous about talking about religion?
No,
No.
not at all. Yeah.
People do the same thing with finances. You're exactly right. And I think one of the things that is actually real, that is not a dynamic that we kind of have interpersonally, is like the intergenerational processes of poverty. Like that's not something that you can kind of therapize your way out of. It's a real kind of systemic issue. And I'm thinking of one time I was working with a couple who they were African American, very low SES, older, much older, with military history actually, and they were filing bankruptcy, and they absolutely needed to file bankruptcy, but I was pulled in. They were working with a financial planner. I was pulled in to kind of help them accept this idea of filing bankruptcy. But culturally, they were like, this isn't what we should be doing. Like, this doesn't feel right. And I try to do some psychoeducation with them. Like, this is, you are American citizens, and bankruptcy like is a thing because like it's your right, essentially, right? You served in the military to protect this country that like has a law that so that you can file bankruptcy for this exact reason, to kind of help you out and let you start over. And they were just not having it. And they were saying, their parents taught them to not take anything that, you can't pay back. And in some ways I saw them as like trapped in this intergenerational cultural systemic trap of poverty, and there was no psychotherapying their way out of it. So I think what we ended up doing was kind of rolling with that resistance, which is what a term a lot of therapists say, and but figuring out other ways to support them through their financial troubles. But yeah, cultural, intergenerational, family stuff, we do a lot of work unlearning unhealthy things and amplifying the things that do work for people. So
that transgenerational too. I think about my own personal testimonies and testimonies that I have with clients of too, when you break that transgenerational pattern, right? I grew up in a not wealthy household, and now to break it, some of my siblings view me as snobby or a yuppie or whatever, right? Or I'm on a high horse, and it creates yet a different kind of fissure, but still a fissure in a family. And it most certainly can, right? Because now we're separated by this socioeconomic status difference. Even if I don't want it to have an impact, inherent in their definition and their narrative of money, it creates this fissure and what they perceive as a power differential.
And you say they like treat you differently.
100%.
Yeah, because they have this perception of your financial status.
Yep. And being privileged or being snobby because of it. Or I hear people say, oh, you're so lucky. I'm not lucky. I worked my tail end off for this. Right. And it's hard because as much as we want our kids to do better, sometimes that can be really threatening to a family.
Yeah.
If someone is
Mhm.
doing better or different or whatever it might be, and finances is one place, religion is one place, right? If we deviate from that, it's interesting.
Education, right? Like, yeah,
Mhm.
um, I think it would be really cool to reflect on like what that means about like so there's a couple of different meaning points in there. Like your family has assigned your money situation as like meaning something about you.
Mhm.
And like I hear in there too, like you created meaning around how they see you as well.
Fair, fair. I have
Um,
clients who go through this and it creates that division,
Mhm.
which is brutal, right? Money has so much, I don't want to say power, but power is part of it, right?
Influence.
Influence. There it is. Just
we
fascinating.
have, yeah, it's heavy with meaning and value. A full circle. I think I said this at the beginning, like about who we are as people. For whatever reason, we have those two things enmeshed: money and meaning and value. So
Mhm.
And that meaning, largely influenced by culture and our family and upbringing, affects our financial model. And if you have
Yeah.
financial goals that are disparate from that, you really have to uncover your own psychology of finances and that model, often unconscious,
Good point.
to be able to move forward, because that's a barrier in itself. And I think
Mhm.
about like people who grow up and they're like, impulsive, right? Their family's impulsive. And then they go out and impulsive and they can't
Yeah.
ever really save because they can't go a certain amount of period without like getting that, dopamine rush because they just bought something, shiny. And I think that's really interesting when we think about the intergenerational transmission of financial models. It goes beyond that. I mean, it affects literally their finances. So
And if you have a savings account in one of those families, right? Maybe it's pressure from family members of why aren't you spending it? Well, I could use a handout, whatever it might be, right? Then it's pressure to spend it on the flip side too.
yeah. Oh man, you're reminding me. I was working with this client a long time ago where her family had a lot of money, and she grew up and became a therapist, and they're all like business owners and kind of rich people, and she's a therapist, and y'all know therapists, our salary is not super sexy.
yeah.
Um, but they lived in like that fancy part of town, and she couldn't, she got married and had kids and couldn't buy a house in that part of town, and couldn't drive the fancy car, and didn't have her kids in the fancy daycares. And her family expected her to kind of do those things that proved her family status, and she couldn't. And oh man, we started really getting into it. When like her parents would offer her money to help her, buy the car or do the daycare, whatever. Man, that brought up so many difficult things for her. The fact that her parents wanted to like basically fund the life that they expected her to have that she couldn't afford. So yeah,
What does that say about her worth and her self-acceptance and acceptance by her parents?
And that
yeah.
might be communicated non-verbally a lot of
Right.
times too. It might not be like direct and overt of like, you're a piece of shit because you don't live where we live.
Feels like judgment. If you have kids, how are they
Yeah.
spending for them on the holidays? How
Mhm.
does that reflect on you as the parent?
And
Oof.
what's interesting is they got that understanding of money to judge potentially their own daughter from their family. And it's just so fascinating to me. There's this one couple where, they grew up, the wife, heterosexual couple, the wife grew up with a lot of money. But it was because her family worked, her father and them worked really hard and were gifted something. So they kind of grew up with this narrative of generosity. We don't care. We
Yeah.
comfortable with money and we're very generous. The message is you got to give because we were given to get where we're at.
Mhm.
They married somebody who's complete opposite, who thought they had nothing, even though they grew up, middle class and, mom paid for all their hockey and all that stuff. But they grew up into this context. And when they use the money, it's almost like no one touch it. Don't breathe on it. Don't do anything. And it's almost like they're afraid to lose this privilege that this partner was just like,
Mhm.
I'm willing to give this away because I was given this and the other person didn't have it. So just their access to money changes their meaning of how they use it and whether they're generous or not. I mean, it's just a very complex situation, hence
Yeah.
probably why it's so emotionally charging for a lot of people and families.
Fascinating.
Yeah. It's like tied to status, tied to control in that story. It's a very fun topic. There's a lot there, and it permeates all the different kinds of families, all the different dynamics, relational dynamics that we learn about in therapy school, all the cultures. It's just like, it's very, I feel like I had something really powerful and sexy that I wanted to say about money, but like, it's just so broad, right?
Yeah. And when we're talking about this kind of in the context of meaning, what comes up to me is professional athletes. So, so those who grew up in, low SES, and then all of a sudden they're just like millions. And some of them, like the NFL, I think they have like a financial class you got to go to as like a rookie. And, but everyone in the woodworks in their community comes out with their hand out.
Same with lottery. And we know that people who win the lottery most often go bankrupt within the first 5 years.
Because they spend that same cycle, the same model of finances exists that they haven't really explored. And hopefully as therapists, as you're talking about, Allie, can get more comfortable with even exploring this as part of a symptom, the beliefs around it, the culture and what it means, more of out of a curiosity rather than a diagnostic kind of sense.
So Allie, I have a question. As a mama, how do you encourage people to talk to their kids, and like when to start having these conversations? How do we from the ground up help our kids feel comfortable talking about this, knowing how to work with this, and really taking their power and control of money?
That's a really good question. And I think the first part of my answer, Kim, you might not like.
Oh no.
I think kids are incredibly smart. They are connected to their moms. Like, they know when you have anxiety, even if you're trying to mask it.
Fascinating. Yep, my kids are exempt.
Totally. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm not talking.
You gotta have a banker for a husband.
You're an exception.
My kids do each have a bank account, and they have a piggy bank that's share, spend, save. When we talk about it, you'd be proud.
So I think number one, I would say, if the parents have money anxieties or avoidance or some stuff there, number one is, like, as a parent, exploring that for yourself, in the same way that, if you're really shy talking about sex and your kids are of the age where you need to start teaching them about sex, like, you better get comfortable with it, right? Number two, I would say, developmental activities like you're describing with your kids, right? They're at the age where they know what spend, save, whatever their little piggy banks are. Share, give, whatever it is. You can start teaching them about those values, right? And because money is inherently tied to like what we value and what is important to us. You could have spend, save, share. So you're teaching them the value of sharing your money or giving it away. You could also have it as like vacation, trip. I've seen little kids that have that with parents that value, experiences. So I think being thoughtful about what are those kind of developmentally appropriate lessons you can share with your kids. I think another important thing is like allowing your kid to experience money, right? If that's going shopping and you give them $5 and then you let them figure out like how it's used and what it means. Same with the credit card, right? Like, I never learned what interest was until I was in my master's program.
And all those student debts just compounding. Wonderful.
Right. Like learning about financial, no one ever sat me down and was like, this is how compounding interest works. Right. And so, like, when they get developmentally there, teaching them about those concepts. And then I would just say, like, talking openly about it. I think kids also have their own social relationships and people that are different than them at school. And so being open to kind of modeling to them, people are different. They have different values than us, and that's okay. Also, I would say particularly with money, like they might feel uncomfortable if you ask them how much money they have. So like know that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with it. Don't go to school asking your friends how much money their parents make.
My kids know what a penis is, but not not money. Nope.
So I got a question for you in that realm, Allie. There's parents who love to who have a lot of money. They're very well off, and they don't want to give anything to their kids, right? There's like kind of like, I see the spectrum. There's the parents who like, I want to give my kids everything and they don't learn responsibility. But then there's parents who like very well off and they're like, I'm making them work for everything. I mean, do you have any thoughts kind of on that spectrum and what you might see as valuable of teaching kids?
I mean, number one disclaimer, like I'm not a parent. So, and I know that like parents like to judge other parents, about what's better or worse.
Preach.
So I'm just gonna, I mean, I don't know, right? Like I had to work from the time I was like 15 years old. So that, you know, my parents weren't just gonna like give me a car to drive around. I had to pay for it. And that worked out for me, I think. Like I'm pretty okay. But I have friends, I know people that their parents, my best friend, her parents paid all the way through her, you know, PhD and
wow.
You know, she has a similar work ethic to me. And so I don't know that I would say like a way is better or worse than one. And also I'm just scared to comment about parenting because parents are
savages.
I mean, it's a good point. And I think kind of underlying that and what we just spoke about a little bit ago in terms of like the messages is like for a parent to be conscientious of your model and what are you doing that might transfer over that you want or don't want, but you have to be aware of it. You have to face it and understand it to know what that value system you want to preach to your kids. Cause I like what you talked about, like going to school with the kids of like, you know, there's gonna be kids who don't have what you have. Like that's a reality. And maybe somebody values like, oh, I don't want you to judge them for that. Maybe there's a parent who have like, stay away from those kids. I mean, who knows?
Yeah. They're out there telling everyone how much money they have. They're freaks.
Yeah.
You would be proud. We do talk about it. We have a 5-year-old. We do talk about it with Harper. Like we talk about money. We talk about how everyone, like her privilege that she has growing up in the SES that we're in. We donate things like this and give when we can. And so we do talk about it. You know, we just don't talk about personal finances ever.
But that's a value system you guys decided was important to communicate, which is, you know.
Thank God for my husband.
Yeah.
100%.
Allie, as we kind of wrap up here, are there kind of any just, you know, as you can think of any tips that you might have for people listening or takeaways that you think are kind of salient in this conversation?
Yeah, I think in this, you know what, I love Brene Brown, but I don't love that I say that I love Brene Brown.
This is so cliche. Everyone loves her.
I know. Well, like we've been talking about vulnerability this whole time, and here she is like writing books, getting famous and stuff on it. Good for her. But one of the things that she talks about that I really like is like shame gremlins. You guys know about that? And so when we keep our shame hidden and we don't talk about it, it's like an echo chamber in our head. It just gets louder and louder and louder. And I think being brave and courageous to talk about this money stuff, because it's so vulnerable and there's likely a lot of shame in it, like I want to encourage people to be brave and talk about these things with people that they trust, like their therapist or their partner, and know that like we all have our own stuff about money that, you know, like I'll tell you something shameful. Like I told my partner all the time, like, please just handle our money because I don't want to do it. Like I talk about it all the time, right? It's the therapist that, you know, preaches about what she can't do herself. And so having those really vulnerable conversations for me is a way that, you know, I expose the things that are really vulnerable, and then people are coming out of the woodworks being like, me too, dude, like I've never heard, anyone describe it like that, but I relate so much to that. So if you're willing to share your story or talk with your family, your partners, about money, like I want to encourage the world to start talking about this stuff, to normalize it. Like we're all kind of in the same boat. And then the other thing is, I think for the therapists, really, I think it's an ethical issue that we're not talking about this and we avoid it, potentially at the risk of like negatively affecting our clients. And so kind of sound the sirens a little bit, like talk about it, people learn about it, get comfortable with it. If you're a therapist working with people, like it's your duty to be able to do that. And I'll send some resources to you guys, but I have like I did a training for therapists on financial wellness for us, and like watch it if you feel like really uncomfortable listening to me talk about this and get comfortable with it. Lean into it, I guess, if I may. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really have any other tips.
I love that.
Yeah, those are great. And we'll definitely appreciate those resources. And, some of the things for me, I think that along with what you said, that normalizing is so important. And in order for it to be normalized, we have to be vulnerable with that too, which also requires us to face it and go back and look at what is finances to me. And with a curious lens, maybe not judgmental, go back and just curiosity of like, how have they played a role in my family? Oh, I can see that playing a role now. And just because if you have a lot of money, you still experience stress. This isn't just for people who don't have money. Like financial stress, it transcends the SES, right? And a lot of it has to do with the meaning we place on it. So explore that. Those are some things that I can think of.
Maybe baby steps. Like if you have anxiety around this, taking baby steps. I hope my husband's not listening. Taking baby steps to expose yourself, to talk about it, to lean into the discomfort, much like we would those other topics.
So don't flood yourself.
Even the word finances floods me. Shoot. Well, thank you so much, Allie. We truly appreciate you joining us today. And
thanks for having me. This has been really fun, and I'm glad that you guys are open and willing to talk about it. It's really important to me, so I appreciate it.
As always, if anyone has any questions or concerns or questions for Dr. Allie, please feel free to email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. But we really appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you, Allie.